As you know, our parliament, we have a parliamentarian system in place, is stepping up the campaign against bribery within government. The war on corruption, as I say, is one of our main problems. On the 12th of September in Prague, there was the forum that took place, and the subject of corruption came up there as well. And the OSCE, within its various undertakings, it was felt that the OSCE should take this up in the sense of monitoring conventions to see who has ratified them and to see just what countries have brought their legislation in line with international standards to fight corruption. I think we also have to step up cooperation among the OSCE countries themselves in order to further identify criminal proceeds as they may have been transferred from one country to another. We need to draw on the expertise other countries can offer in identifying some of these trails. When we talk about public expenditure, I think we also need to concentrate on the fact that we cannot confine ourselves to a handful of economic indicators. The reason I say this is because when we look at these things separately, we don't get the overall picture as to what the impact of the financial crisis has been on other indicators and what the interlinkage may be. If we look at the balance of payments, we can see immediately, for example, that we're importing, for example, fuels and lubricants, that the agricultural sector depends on a tremendous amount of imports, primarily coming in from Russia. And that is also determined by the prices on the Brent oil markets. So clearly, the effect on our country is felt in that sense too. We export gold, and that increases, but increases in price for gold also affect our country. What I'm trying to say by these examples is that if we're going to somehow emerge from this crisis, we'll have to see how all of these macroeconomic indicators interlink to see what public expenditure is, budget allocations, for example, and other matters, and then we can see just where the weakest links are. What I wanted to point out is as well that when we are seeing public outlays in our country, they are agreed upon within our national context. It's not that we're going to change the clothes we wear simply to conform to a different standard. We are trying to involve civil society in a sense as well. Throughout all of the government structures, there are social monitoring councils who can say openly just how they can see and they can say just how a given government department is spending the funds for which they're responsible. And this is an excellent system to ensure transparency within state structures. Against this backdrop, I feel that we would also like to study the experience of those countries who successfully emerged from the financial crisis. Perhaps there's some kind of a model or doctrine that is available where we could gain from learning about the most advanced programs that have been put in place to cope with the economic and financial crisis that would enable OSCE participating states to coordinate their own mechanisms and thereby counteract some of the consequences of the crisis. I think there has been an exchange of experience. All of the countries represented in the Parliamentary Assembly can organize a means of taking this up. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Der nächste Redner
Next
ist Mr. Lipins aus Latvia und in Vorbereitung, Mr. Aknas Adiraev aus Kasachstan. Entschuldigung.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Уважаемые коллеги, дамы и господа, прежде всего я хотел бы выразить от имени делегации Республики Казахстан
just how
Искреннюю
grateful
благодарность
the delegation
парламенту
from
Албании
Kazakhstan
и
is to the
Международному
Albanian
секретариату
Parliament and the
Парламентской
International
ассамблеи
Secretary of
ОБСЕ
the OSCE
за
Parliamentary
прекрасную
Assembly for the
организацию
excellent way in which
осенней
they've
сессии.
organized the fall session.
Весьма актуальную тему, надо сказать,
I
организаторы
think the
вынесли
organizers
на
came up
обсуждение
with a
участников данного
particularly
заседания,
relevant subject, and having us
и поэтому
discuss
мы с
this
большим
matter here
вниманием и
now, and that
интересом
is why we're listening
заслушали
so
выступления
carefully
основных
and
докладчиков.
with such interest to
Я
what
хотел
the
бы
various
кратко остановиться на некоторых
speakers had to
аспектах
say.
экономической политики
I
Казахстана
just
и
wanted to
наших
talk about some of the
инициативах,
aspects of our own
направленных на
economic
поиск
policies
путей
in
решения
Kazakhstan to
финансово-экономических
counteract
проблем
the
на
financial and
национальном
economic
и
crisis,
региональном уровнях.
both nationally and regionally.
Несмотря на то, что
Despite the
Казахстан
fact that
сохраняет стабильный
Kazakhstan
экономический рост
itself
на
has
уровне
been able to maintain stable
6-7%,
economic growth to
посткризисный
the
период,
tune of 67%
одной из
in the
основных задач
post-crisis
нашего
phase,
правительства остается
our
укрепление
government is
финансовой
nevertheless
дисциплины.
still concentrating on financial
Для повышения
discipline.
эффективности
In order to
использования бюджетных
improve the
средств
way in which budget
продолжается
allocations are
масштабная
utilized,
оптимизация
we are
бюджетных
trying to
расходов.
optimize such
При этом приоритет
outlays,
отдается расходам,
and the
обеспечивающим
priority is
экономический
placed
рост и
on
занятость
what
населения.
can further boost economic growth
В целях
and
борьбы
employment.
с последствиями финансово-экономического
In
кризиса
grappling with
с
the financial and
2008
economic
года
crisis that
в
started
стране
off in
успешно
2008,
функционирует
we
специальный
have
фонд
had
благосостояния
special
народа, Самрук
social
Казна.
welfare funds
Его
in place,
деятельность
some of
направлена
which
главным
are
образом
slim
на
since
стабилизацию
2008.
финансовой системы,
This is aimed at stabilizing
оживление
the financial
жилищного
system
строительства,
and affecting
поддержку малого
recovery
и
in the
среднего
housing
бизнеса,
sector,
реализацию
supporting
программы индустриализации
SME
Казахстана.
and in
Уже
carrying
на
out
стадии
industrialization
практической
programs in
реализации сегодня
Kazakhstan, also
находится
trying to
программа
engage in
народного
social
IPO,
modernization.
которая
We're
предусматривает активное
also in
участие
the
населения
phase of
страны
practical
в
implementation of
приобретении
an
акций
IPO
высокорентабельных национальных
program,
компаний.
and this will involve
Учитывая
the
специфику
acquisition
трудового
of
рынка
shares in
и
national
экономику регионов,
companies.
правительством принята специальная
Given
программа
the specific
по
nature of the
развитию
labor
моногородов,
market and
где
the
основная часть
economies of
населения
the region,
работает
we have
только
also
на
engaged in a
одном
special
предприятии.
program to develop a factory town, so
Другим
their equivalent where most of
немаловажным
the people in a given
аспектом,
town work for
несмотря
one
на
and the same
кризис,
employer.
несомненно, является экология.
There's another area
Мы,
that
как
we
и
have to
наши
concentrate
европейские
on, that is
партнеры,
part and parcel of the crisis,
уделяем
that is
особое
the
внимание
environmental
вопросам перехода
dimension.
к зеленой экономике.
We have been looking into the matter of moving towards a green economy like many of our European partners, so that would be concentrating on renewables and environmentally clean technologies. Kazakhstan itself has been arguing in favor of a Green Bridge partnership. It's something we hope will be on display at the Expo 2017 that we would like to host ourselves. We're looking to the overseas participating states to support us in our bid, which will be decided on at the meeting in Paris in November, where the final decision as to the organizing country will be taken. The Green Bridge program itself is a practical mechanism for effecting an international transition to green economies by technological and know-how transfers, and also by incorporating best practices in the legal, economic, and institutional sectors, providing stimulus incentives for green industries. For 5 years, we've also been hosting the forum in our own capital that has drawn in leading economic and financial experts. We are enjoying support from around the world for this G Global initiative, this online economic forum as well. As I say, this has been operating for 5 years. And there are now 30,000 people from 140 different countries in the world who are using it.
An Bord ist nun Mr. Lipins aus Latvia und in Vorbereitung Mr. Dera aus Polen.
Mr. Dera from Poland to prepare. He'll be the following speaker. Thank you.
So I didn't follow. Is that me next? Lipins?
Yes, Lipins is the next.
Thank you.
Yes, Herr Lipins.
First of all, I'd like to say that we really sympathize with what Greece is going through at this moment. We have had a very similar experience, although luckily not as serious as that experienced by Greece. In 2008 and 2009, Latvia's economy shrank by 25%. In 2011, Latvia's economy grew by 5.5% and is forecast to grow by another 5% this year and 5% next year. And this is against this general picture of gloom, doom and gloom. Latvia needed and obtained an IMF and an EU bailout. However, today its credit rating is on an upward path, and it can borrow once again in the international financial markets. So what happened? It was the usual suspect, a property boom and hefty inflation, and a country unprepared for the world financial crisis that hit all of us. And it was private spending and debt, rather than government spending and debt, that brought the economy down. But it was to a large extent the government's doing. It ignored many signs and many warnings about the overheating of the economy. Instead of drawing back, spending less, and augmenting savings for a rainy day, it put its foot to the pedal. It's not what Keynes would have suggested. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy. The economy required restructuring whatever fiscal policy was to be implemented. So at that point, there appeared to be only one option, or one other option. It's devaluation, but two ways of achieving it, externally or internally. The external option was already too late. Instead of a gradual devaluation of the currency earlier, a massive devaluation would be needed in 2008. And that was part of the recommendation stemming from the IMF and an eminent economist. The other part was fiscal stimulation. And this stemmed to a large part from a misdiagnosis of the problem, that it was related to poor growth rather than untenable public debt and private debt. Latvia disregarded this advice and turned to internal devaluation and strict austerity. The government slashed expenditures to the tune of approximately 10% of GDP and significantly cut the budget deficit and, as a result, also inflation. It took the internal devaluation route for two main reasons. One, external devaluation would have stoked inflation and the initial gains would have been wiped out in short order. The situation would have been worse than before. Also, people had taken debt in euros to satisfy their free spending urges, which they simply would not have been able to repay in devalued lats. And there was one further reason. Latvia had set a course to adopt the euro and had pegged the lat to the euro. Unpegging it would have put paid to Latvia's prospects of joining the eurozone in the foreseeable future. However, the internal devaluation was vicious. It caused many bankruptcies and personal tragedies, a massive emigration approaching some 15% of the population, and an increase in the unemployment level, which would have been higher still except for the emigration. So we have paid a huge price in human terms now, and will continue to pay it for a long time to come. Most of those who emigrated were of working age, and many have now established roots in their adopted countries and are unlikely to return to Latvia. In one fell swoop, we have lost several generations of productive labor. The consequences of an external devaluation would probably have been just as bad and perhaps even worse. It could have had a domino effect on the banking system in the Nordic countries in particular, but also in a wider area of Europe. And it would have put a stop on our way to the euro. We are already satisfying the Maastricht criteria and are likely to stay on course to join the eurozone in 2014. Whether we do so is another question, but we would have the option of not applying, which we would not otherwise have had. We have also voted for fiscal discipline in the belief that it would be good for us regardless of whether we adopt the euro or continue to be pegged to it. Whether our experience can be applied to the countries still in crisis or on the brink of bankruptcy is a moot point. It seems that some initially sought salvation through spending and did not realize that this would not solve, but rather augment the fundamental problem of a high national debt that the financial markets would not sustain. In conclusion, Latvia had to choose between two evils. Not so happily then, we chose austerity, but seem to have been vindicated at least for now. Our budget for 2012 has performed better than expected, and we have been able to replenish some of the funds that we had to cut. Thank you for your attention.
Dankeschön auch. Und an Bord ist nun Mr. Dera aus Polen, in Vorbereitung Mrs. Kauma aus Finnland.
Mr. Chair, colleagues, if we would like to answer the question how to deal with the crisis, we should go back in time to the genesis of crisis. Nowadays, economic and euro crisis is due to the bank crisis. Problem is of the biggest bank in the world had an influence on economic situation. We live in the world where everything is connected. There are not deserted islands, which can they all be themselves. When in one place the economy is destabilized, then the other has also some problems. That's domino effect. Euro can be saved only when we start working together, but this work must be responsible. We can be sure that a common currency will last. If not, then it can cause money problem for the other member of European Union, bigger crisis at those countries. Investors are afraid that euro will fall apart. Chairmen of global companies want to know how the change of euro to the national currency will be done. We can also observe disintegration in financial market. Capital is running away from danger countries. Due to this situation, we have rising difference in financial cost for government and companies in different countries. The same company which work in Germany or Spain must pay different interest from its debts. To sum up, I will repeat, then only when they work together and responsible, we will save euro and stop the crisis in European Union. Thank you.
Danke auch für Ihre präzise und in der Zeit sich befindliche Wortmeldung. Am Wort ist nun Mrs. Kauma aus Finnland und in Vorbereitung Monsieur Alaneri aus Frankreich, auch Vizepräsident unserer Versammlung.
Mr. President, as we all know, the economic and financial crisis, which started in 2008, is still not closer to its solution. The euro crisis affects every country in a different way, but one common feature is that public finances and the banking sector are too closely interconnected. Many banks have become so big that it is impossible to supervise or manage them in a responsible way. What we need today is a very clear roadmap to guide us out from this situation. It is clear that we need several simultaneous operations in each country as far as public spending is concerned. However, what is also important, we all need to work together in order to create a much more healthy and much more solid European banking sector in the future. We need reliable bank supervision that will cover not only the big banks, but also the smaller ones. What we really need is a banking union. I think that a banking union would be a solution that would help us create a credible long-term European banking supervision system that would help us prevent similar financial problems that we are now facing. However, we have to be very careful when we create the details of the banking union. As you know, the devil often lies with the details. This means that there is a risk that we will overreact when it comes to bank regulations. Banks will, in fact, be facing more severe solvency and liquidity requirements in the future. Some of them come from Basel III regulations. Mind you also that some countries, like Finland, are going to introduce a particular bank tax from the beginning of the year 2013. All this means that in a fairly short period of time, banks will be facing a lot of new regulations that were not in place before the crisis. Now, how about the financial transaction tax? I think it's fair to say that many people don't even know what it means. As a matter of fact, it is calculated out of the volume of transactions, not of the financial profit of a bank. This is a very important thing to notice. I think that implementing a new tax like this only in the Eurozone or even the whole of Europe would harm severely the competitiveness of all Europe. Many financial institutions would move their activities outside Europe, and it would be the customers that would be paying the bill of the tax in form of a higher cost of money. Financial transaction tax would be a good solution only if it was implemented on a global level so that at least most of the G20 countries would accept to implement it. Dear President, the economic crisis has for too long a time captured all the attention of the decision makers in Europe. Many of the long-term challenges, like for example the growing problem of youth unemployment, have been left aside, sadly. I think that it is about time we started to talk about these issues as well.
Thank you. Your friend from France, Mr. Neri, you have the floor. Sie sind am Wort. Und in Vorbereitung Miss Isabel Santos aus Portugal.
Santos from Portugal to prepare. She will follow the next speaker.
Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues,
President, dear
voilà
colleagues,
un an que ce débat est
for
inscrit à l'ordre
a
du jour de
year
chacune
now,
de
we've
nos
had this item on the agenda of each one of our sessions, which underscores the importance of it to our countries. Not only is the economic and financial crisis that has been ongoing for 5 years now made our economies and our societies ever more fragile, but it has also called into question our very credibility, our ability to respond. This is why it seems crucial to me that we try to come up with some common front. I'm wondering, nevertheless, President, as to the way in which we have entitled this session
Lors de notre réunion de bureau à Copenhague en avril dernier, j'avais assisté auprès de notre collègue Tony Lloyd
April,
pour
I
que ce
had
rapport
insisted
consacré à la
that
crise
our colleague Mr.
économique
Miliori
ne se focalise
draw
pas
a
uniquement
report that did
sur les
not
politiques de
concentrate
rigueur et
merely on
d'austérité,
austerity
mais examine
policies
également
and
et
measures,
propose des
but
moyens
rather that
de
it
relancer la
include
croissance.
proposals for
Mon idée
relaunching growth.
était
My
alors
idea
et elle
at the
reste
time,
que la rigueur et la
then
relance
and still
doivent être
now,
combinées au
has
service
been
de la
that
croissance.
recovery
De
should
ce fait,
serve
il me paraît
growth.
regrettable que notre Assemblée donne le
That our
sentiment
assembly
qu'elle oppose
should
ces deux
convey the
notions,
idea
alors que la
that
rigueur et la relance doivent au contraire constituer les deux
austerity
faces d'une
and
même
recovery
volonté,
should be seen as
celle de
two
l'espoir de
sides of
retour
the
à la
same
croissance
effort
partagée
that is
dans le
trying to
cadre
come
d'une
back to
politique de
shared
solidarité
growth
européenne
within
en
the
actes et pas
concept
seulement
within the
en paroles.
context of a European solidarity framework. Within the current context of social need, no one can deny, whatever their
Qu'une
political
certaine
affiliation
rigueur est
is,
nécessaire
that
et que
austerity
l'effort
is
collectif est
necessary
indispensable.
and that we
Mais d'ores et
need to
déjà,
have a collective
on
effort.
peut affirmer
But
qu'une
at the same
austérité
time, we can
insupportable,
see
parce
that
que trop brutale,
austerity can
parce que trop
prove to be
brutale,
over
et qui
brutal,
frappe toujours en priorité les plus défavorisés et les plus
necessarily
fragiles, ne
hitting
peut que
hardest
déboucher
the
sur
most
des réactions
vulnerable
tout aussi
and
brutales, voire sur une explosion sociale.
those
Il ne faut
without
pas confondre
funds
rigueur et
in
austérité.
society. We cannot
Si je suis prêt à accepter une
equate
certaine
austerity
rigueur,
and
je
recovery.
m'interroge.
I'm agreeing
Quelle
to a
forme
certain
doit-elle
level
prendre?
of austerity,
Comment la
but I
mettre en
have to
œuvre?
understand just
Ce
what
sont là
form
les
that will
véritables
take, how it
questions
will
que
be
nous
applied.
devons nous
And
poser.
those are the real
En effet,
questions
il ne
we should
suffit
be
pas de
asking
demander à nos
ourselves.
concitoyens de
It's
faire
not
des efforts,
a matter of
même
saying
s'ils ont
citizens
conscience
should
de leur
tighten their
nécessité.
belts, even if they
Encore faut-il
understand the
savoir
need to do so. We
concrètement
have to
ce
see
que
more
nous leur
specifically
demandons.
just what it
Or,
is
à
we
cet
are
égard, je
asking
crois que
of our
d'une
people.
part,
And in that sense, I believe that we're otherwise only going to give rise to social grumblings and social exclusion if we don't do something to ensure that the effects are felt equally across the board. Otherwise, we will
des sacrifices
paralyze
sans
and
leur offrir des
put off
perspectives
people,
en
asking
termes
them
d'emploi et
to
de pouvoir d'achat.
make sacrifices
Il faut
without
agir pour la
providing them
croissance
some means
et non
of
se contenter
in
d'attendre tranquillement
maintaining
que
purchasing power.
l'assainissement des finances
I
publiques
believe that
permette au mieux,
public
dans
funds,
quelques années,
to some
et
extent,
encore si
will
les
have
marchés
to,
sont
over the
alors-
next
sont alors
few
retrouvés à la
years, and if
confiance,
we,
une
the
hypothétique
markets
reprise.
have regained some of
C'est
their
pour cette
former
raison
position, that
que
this
le
will be a means of
gouvernement
recovery.
français
That is why the
propose
French
aujourd'hui
government is
d'accroître la
currently
contribution des
proposing
plus
that we
fortunés à
increase
l'effort de rigueur.
the contribution made by those who are best off,
D'une part, du développement dans
that
l'investissement du
this
logement
would
social,
develop
et d'autre part de
investments in
l'emploi,
social
en
sectors,
particulier
and
celui
at the
des
same
jeunes
time
qui
that we
constituent
look
bien
to the
souvent
young
les
people
premières victimes
and
de la crise.
who were so often
Redonner
bearing the
l'espoir aux
brunt of the
jeunes,
crisis, to
c'est
see how we
aussi
can
pour
help
leurs
them.
familles
And this is, by extension, assisting their families and indeed the whole of our population so that they can regain hope and confidence in the future and that we can restore social cohesion. I support the proposal made by my colleague to that effect, and I'm delighted to hear that there may be other proposals along the same lines. I believe that our Parliamentary Assembly does have a job, and that is to be a brainstorming lab and that we exchange experience. So it is my hope that this debate will enable us to go home with new ideas and new proposals. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Monsieur Neri.
Thank you.
Nächste Rednerin ist Ms. Santos, auch Vizepräsidentin
also
des dritten Komitees. Sie haben das Wort in Vorbereitung. Mr. Salim Soda aus Tadschikistan.
From Tajikistan to be preparing. You will follow her.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles Dickens, at the beginning of The Tale of Two Cities, wrote, "It was the best of the times. It was the worst of the times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness." And I stress that nowadays we live in a time not so different from that period. Dickens' words could also describe our current situation. We are always talking a lot about austerity, finance, and taxation. And we forget to talk about life, about people, about democracy, about politics. We are living moments overly dominated by finance and forget the primacy of politics. And that is a mistake of unpredictable consequences. We cannot forget that the origin of the crisis is in the financial system, nor can we forget that the overcome of crisis, we cannot compromise the values of democracy, equality, and solidarity. It is in the most difficult moments that we are mandated to take great and courageous decisions. And now the options of Europe have to pass clearly for the people, for the endogenous resources, for a green economy, for protecting the integrity of the European project, for a better supervision of markets. Yes, we need to spend less, and perhaps we need to spend better. But we need also more active citizenship and to look to our common space as a space of growth, equal opportunities, solidarity, security, and peace. And this is not possible with a dictatorship of austerity, insensitive to the conditions of life, with perverse effects on what is concerned by European solidarity and the future of the new generations. Thank you.
Thank you too. Und am Wort ist nun Mr. Salim Soda aus Tadschikistan, in Vorbereitung Mr. Gekman Mian aus Armenien.
Уважаемый господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги, актуальным вопросом таджикско-европейского сотрудничества является содействие Афганистану в миростроительстве.
There is a continual military threat emanating from that part of the world, as well as a drug smuggling threat. There's been a coalition in place, and Tajikistan has continued to serve as a broker, trying to ward off the drugs threat from Afghanistan. But we would like to see an economically independent country, a neutral one, where they can finally see stability restored. Peace and security to be restored to the region. This is something we have called for from international fora for some time now. We have a very extended border with Afghanistan. Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers, and yet it is, and we are the first ones to feel the drug trafficking that comes out of Afghanistan. We feel the full brunt. It's very difficult for us to withstand this. It has transnational ramifications. And so we look to other countries where there is a huge demand for the drugs being supplied. We look to Pakistan as well. But we need support from the international community. Our country has proposed a Dushanbe-Mashhad-Shiraz railway link, which could cost some hundreds of millions of US dollars. But it would do much to boost economic growth in the region, and it would move us out of the transport impasse we have known and the crisis that we have been feeling. There is an additional amount of US $6 million that could enable us to incorporate environmentally clean technologies, and that this too could assist us in our collaborating with Afghanistan. I think this would also do much for making Afghanistan and other neighboring countries, and in energy terms, self-sustaining. Our strategic allies and our neighbor, Uzbekistan, has nevertheless continued an economic blockade of our country, and by all means, some illicit have tried to block efforts to trade with Kyrgyzstan. We are trying to work on renewables and environmentally friendly technologies. There is a tremendous need for power generation. But despite the need, the Uzbeks have been putting forth various trumped-up reasons, trying to get investors to support the building of a power station that would benefit Uzbekistan. This is something that has been in discussions back since the Soviet times, but we believe that this could also have implications for water supply and would be tantamount to display social manipulation, manipulating public opinion. And this will lead to ever more economic problems for my country. This, as we're in the throes of financial crisis, yet another example of what we're enduring at the hands of our neighbors in terms of the
Might I interrupt you briefly? We're here to talk about the financial and economic crisis, and I would ask you, please, to try and keep to the subject that we've chosen. If you would be a little closer to that issue. Thank you.
Так, чтобы больше денег просто разобрать железнодорожную ветку, чтобы больше денег заработать на выводе войск Западной коалиции из Афганистана и оставить 3 миллиона жителей нашей южной области в транспортной блокаде, что повлекло серьезным повышением цен даже на продукты питания.
Sharp escalation in prices even for food commodities. And this is tantamount to ignoring the human rights of an entire nation. In the principles that govern relations among the countries that was approved by the Parliamentary Assembly, it is stressed that the rational and fair world order has got to be based on mutual trust and good neighborly relations through proper partnership. I believe that this session is an opportunity for the OSCE-PA to properly assess the situation and work out collective measures for preventing such things in future. Thank you.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Ich ersuche jetzt noch die nachfolgenden Redner.
So, I'd ask the following
an das
speakers,
Thema, das wir gegeben
please,
haben,
to stick
Wirtschafts- und
closely
Finanzkrise, sich
to
zu
the
halten.
issue of
Es ist
financial
heute nicht
and economic
das
crisis.
Thema, politische Konflikte auszudiskutieren, sondern über diese Problematik, über die wir bisher diskutiert haben, zu sprechen.
Refrain from talking about that. I'm sure in other meetings and committees we'll have an opportunity to talk about other things. So I now give the floor
Gegman Meian aus Armenien in Vorbereitung. Mr. Stylianides aus Zypern. Er ist auch Berichterstatter des ersten Komitees.
Distinguished colleagues, our discussions may amount to very little if we don't concentrate on how we are to counteract the consequences of the financial and economic crisis, rather than go into a detailed analysis of the reasons behind the crisis. This is, I think, one of the main reasons have already been explained by international economists, and that amounts to saying that the current economic structures have outlived themselves. There have been global monopolies in their chase after profits have themselves triggered a crisis of overproduction. Banks themselves have accorded far too many loans, and that itself has injected falsism on the part of the population. And yet there were no real assets there in place to back up this euphoria. We saw what happened in the US. The amount of debt was tenfold larger than the debt worldwide. After we dispensed with the Bretton Woods system and the Mearmight system was adopted, this led to uncontrolled emissions for issues of international reserves. This led to a huge disbalance in economies. Unfortunately, not enough is said about this among the world leaders. Only one Russian leader spoke about this back in 2009 in a speech before the Davos World Economic Forum. But unless we come up with answers to these specific questions, we are not going to accomplish anything. We continue to diagnose a serious economic disease, but we're doing nothing to cure the patient. I think we can amend this if we focus rather on those matters, because it's only by tackling them that we can come up with solutions to the matters of greatest concern to the world. There is a global monopoly that is being exercised over all economic and financial matters in the world. This can be traced back to the United States of America. Suffice it to say that the GDP of the country is anywhere from 18 to 20% of the world, of the global GDP, and that affords Americans, the American people, opportunities. That is, they account for 40% of the world's GDP. 20 to 25% of the consumption of the GDP remains there. And even prosperous Europe is not in a position to do much about this, to resolve the global economic problems that are affecting the entire world. Why is it we're always talking about Greece and saying that they have now crossed the 60% barrier in terms of their state debt as it compares with the GDP, but nobody's saying anything about the UK or Japan, where the external debt vis-a-vis the GDP exceeds 200%. Why are we only trying to hear out Greece? Until such time we acknowledge the true nature of the economic crisis, we will make no headway. We have got to understand that the world economic system, as I say, has outlived itself. All we can hope to do at best is to maintain current concerns affecting only stagnation and a new spiral of crisis. I would like to say, in conclusion, that the world community is looking to us for radical change in the world financial and economic system. This was frankly stated by Vladimir Putin back in 2009. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Herr Gegmann-Mian, für die interessanten Aspekte, die Sie auch
interesting aspect you introduced
Und
from a different
am Wort
perspective.
ist nun
I
Mr.
now give the floor
Stylianides.
to Mr.
Ich habe zuerst
Stylianides,
gesagt, als Rapporteur vom ersten
instead of his
Komitee,
rapporteur
korrigiere
from
vom
the first
zweiten
committee. I'm
Komitee,
sorry, let me
aus
correct
Zypern
myself. So
und
to
in
speak, he's the
Vorbereitung
rapporteur of the
Mr.
second
Walsh
committee,
aus
and then Mr.
Ireland.
Walsh from
Bitte schön,
Ireland.
Sie haben das Wort,
Yes, go ahead.
Kollege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to say congratulations to Mr. Matthias Kollatz for his approach. Essentially, I totally agree with him, but allow me to repeat some critical approaches of his stance and positions. Essentially, Mr. Matthias, for me, with a very, very strong and powerful argumentation, reject the artificial dilemma between austerity versus growth. And this is very critical for all of us to accept as the starting point of this discussion. At the same time, also, I would like to say congratulations to Mr. Voridis for his brief and systematic political and financial analysis of the Greek issue. I think Mr. Voridis essentially put on the table the major and critical issue for all Europeans, that the Greek issue is not only Greek, essentially is a European issue. And the solution of this very difficult and very complicated issue is on the European hands. And it's necessary to have a European solution, not a Greek solution. This is the fifth consecutive year of a financial and economic crisis which affected the lives of millions of citizens across and beyond the European continent. The Eurozone is faced with a serious systematic crisis. This is an economic, financial, social, and political crisis which particularly threatens its more stressed and less competitive economies. Economic indicators show a weak growth for the remainder of the year and a gradual recovery onwards. It's therefore crucial that the Union's threefold stability, coordination and governance be given full impulse. Yet, it is now established that fiscal consolidation alone does not suffice to exit the crisis. According to the Eurostat, unemployment in the Eurozone reached 11 to 2% and 10 or over 25 million people in the EU past June. Cyprus, for its part, with 10% in total and over 25% among young people, records the third speedized rise of unemployment in the Eurozone. The Cyprus government, being at the stage of bailout negotiation with the Troika, has completed its package of proposal and is currently in consultations with political leaders and and other stakeholders. As opposition, my party in opposition, will try to promote the right measure and at the same time to avoid mistake of the Greek and other Portuguese example. Boosting competitiveness and job creation constitutes an essential condition towards sustainable growth and the fulfillment of the goals of Europe 2020 strategy. In this respect, greater focus is placed on restoring normal lending to the economy and on supporting innovation and entrepreneurship, especially small and medium enterprises. This constitutes the driving force of Europe's economy and high priority of the Cyprus presidency of the Council of the EU under its motto for a better Europe. Greater focus must also be placed on education and skills development and on their adjustment to the labor market needs. In this respect, it's very important to further promote cooperation between states and with all stakeholders at the national, European, and of course, international level. Universal job-rich growth cannot be achieved in the absence of a sound economic environment characterized by better governance, transparency, and accountability. The President of the European Commission, in his State of the Union address, was clear in stressing the urgent need for greater political will, common responsibility, commitment, and solidarity to prevail in order to deal with the major issues upon which depends the future of the Euro and the Eurozone. The urgent appeal of the President of the EU upon the Eurozone member state in view of the next EU summit this month goes in the same direction. Calls for greater political will and consensus are highly relevant within and beyond the EU, given the increasingly globalized world in which we live and the further spillover risk of the crisis. The OSCE, as per its broadness and flexibility and the context of its economic environmental dimension and its platform for cooperative security, can be instrumental in promoting its founding principles to best serve these aims. It's our duty as members of the OSCE, legislator and guardians of citizens' rights and interests to work in synergy towards a fair and more prosperous world for today's youth and for future generations. Thanks a lot.
Danke. Wir haben noch 3 Redner, also wir sind in der Zeit und es werden dann die beiden Referenten noch um ihre Schlussstatements gebeten, sodass wir pünktlich wahrscheinlich um halb 6 schließen können. Am Wort ist nun Mr. Walsh aus Irland, bitte, gefolgt von Mr. Bisset aus Frankreich.
Can I just first of all start by complimenting both Drs. Preci and Kolatz on their presentation to the meeting here today. In anticipation of Dr. Kolatz being able to respond, I have 4 questions for him. Firstly, he said in his address that the crisis was much deeper and longer than first envisaged. My question is, why was that wrong prognosis made? I remember in 2008 being at a presentation in an investment house in Dublin where a former CEO of one of our major banks stated very clearly that the presentation wasn't nearly as negative as it needed to be, that all the ingredients were there to revert to what happened during the time of the Great Depression. And I would like to ask, what your response in relation to that delay in coming to this conclusion was, because it certainly has delayed appropriate action. My second question is to do with a statement made by the American economist in July, Dr. Nouriel Roubini, where he said that 2013 would in fact be the perfect storm. And he gave 4 reasons for that. One was that the sovereign debt within Europe would peak, with some of the major economies being involved. Secondly, he felt the US would revert into recession after the election. Thirdly, he felt that there would be a drop-off in global demand because of slower growth in economies such as China. And fourthly, he actually predicted that Iran would be invaded, with consequences obviously for oil supplies. Do you think his prognosis is too pessimistic? My third question is to do with austerity versus growth, the title of our paper. Often they are presented as mutually exclusive. Would you agree, in fact, that both are essential if we're to achieve recovery? Countries like households cannot live beyond their means must live within their means. Would you accept that as a principle? And my very last question is one which my Greek colleagues raised, and certainly it's an issue in Ireland, and I think it's an issue and going to be a bigger issue in other economies. The European Union has been very slow at 120% of GDP. Now, I think we need to distinguish between insolvency and also debt that's manageable, which many economists claim should not go beyond 90%, or otherwise it'll be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for countries to extricate themselves from those difficulties. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Am Wort ist nun Mr. Bizet aus Frankreich und der letzte Redner ist Mr. Ich hoffe, dass ich das richtig, den Namen richtig ausspreche, Achikos aus der Türkei. Wenn nicht, dann entschuldigen Sie. Also Mr. Bizet ist am Wort.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Austérité contre croissance. L'intitulé de cette table ronde n'est pas, à mon avis, la meilleure façon de poser le problème, mais elle a au moins le grand mérite de provoquer nos réactions. On ne doit pas opposer, à mon avis, systématiquement austérité et relance. Pour les pays européens trop endettés, aujourd'hui, l'austérité budgétaire est incontournable. Non seulement c'est une obligation découlant des traités, mais encore les marchés sont là pour sanctionner un pays qui ne maîtrise pas sa dette, ne l'oublions pas. Vouloir s'endetter davantage pour relancer l'économie, ce serait imposer et s'imposer une dette plus difficile à financer, plus coûteuse, ce qui supprimerait l'effet de relance. C'est donc une politique indéfendable. Bien sûr, à court terme, avouons-le, l'austérité a momentanément un effet récessif. Mais cela ne dure pas si l'austérité a été accompagnée de réformes préparant l'avenir. On l'a bien vu dans le cas de l'Allemagne. Je ne dis pas qu'il faut copier l'Allemagne, mais je dis qu'il faut s'en inspirer. En réalité, il y a deux types d'austérité. Il y a une austérité sans perspective, qui consiste à augmenter les impôts pour combler les déficits, et il y a une austérité porteuse d'avenir, qui consiste au contraire à réduire les dépenses et à faire les réformes nécessaires pour avoir des entreprises plus compétitives. Cette deuxième forme d'austérité ne s'oppose pas à la croissance, au contraire, elle la prépare. La vraie question qui est posée aux pays européens lorsqu'ils sont trop endettés, ce n'est donc pas austérité ou croissance, ou relance, pardon. C'est plutôt l'austérité étant inévitable, est-elle accompagnée des réformes structurelles appropriées? Voilà la vraie question. La clé du problème, c'est d'augmenter le potentiel de croissance de nos pays par la formation, la recherche, l'innovation, l'efficacité du marché du travail, la création d'un environnement juridique et fiscal favorable aux entreprises, avec, ne l'oublions jamais, une stabilité et une continuité des politiques mises en œuvre à cet effet. Contrairement à ce que soutient un keynésianisme sommaire, très éloigné des vues nuancées du grand économiste anglais, la maîtrise de la dépense publique n'est pas en elle-même ennemie de la croissance. La vraie question est d'intégrer cette maîtrise nécessaire à une démarche d'ensemble qui prépare l'avenir. C'est cette démarche à laquelle, je crois savoir, le président du Conseil Van Rompuy invitera prochainement les pays qui souhaitent contractualiser avec l'Union européenne pour s'engager dans des réformes, avec en contrepartie un soutien et un accompagnement de l'Union européenne. La convergence et la gouvernance économique de l'Union européenne seront à ce prix. Je vous remercie.
Danke vielmals. Und letzter Redner ist Mr. Achikos aus der Türkei. Bitte, Sie haben das Wort.
Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, in the beginning, I want to thank Albanian delegation for their great hospitality. The global economy remains in a difficult phase and downside risks are significant. Growth is slowing in both advanced and emerging economies. Among the advanced economies,
einige der Punkte zu antworten. Es wird unmöglich sein, auf alle zu antworten. To start with the last one, I think the speaker of Turkey was a little bit too modest, because in one respect Turkey had really a very different situation by most of the other countries, because when the crisis emerged, Turkey had already overcome a very severe and significant banking crisis. And one of the lessons which were learned in Turkey were really to reshape the banking system, which much stronger supervision and other things. So, and therefore it turned out that the system was then much more resilient than it had been one decade before, when the crisis was very strongly hitting Turkey. So, and this is one of the lessons we can learn altogether, that some of the means which were already introduced in Turkey by this situation have really delivered a kind of a proof. So therefore it is right to go the way to a more regulated and more robust banking system, and it will turn out also in other countries as a right way forward. Then I think the 4 questions raised by Ireland will create a huge debate, so I will try to be short. Even if I have talked between growth impact or growth impulses and budget consolidation. So, and I'm not as pessimistic as Rubini, but also other authors in the literature say that it is difficult in the long run to survive with a stock of state debt beyond 90%, and this makes it so important that it is at least to achieve. Have a significant number of countries with higher than 90%. To go down to this 90%, it's so important that the interest rate is rather moderate, because the volume and the interest rate together, not only the volume and the interest rate together makes.
Disa komente që u bën këtu, mendoj që efektet e krizës, duam apo s'duam, janë të tilla që çdo vend do të mbajmë vete peshën e saj, ndërkohë politikat se takon rritjes takseve dhe uljes shpenzimeve meten çështje specifike e vendeve të veçanta, me avantazhin që vendet që janë pjesë e Bashkimit Evropian kanë mundësi për të përfituar mbështetje. Ndoshta është koha që përveç ekonomisë së dijes, vëmendja të rikthehet tek avantazhet konkurruese dhe krahasuese si mjeti që merr vlerë në kushtet e krizës dhe që jep mundësi për të rritur konkurrueshmërinë. Ndërkohë, bashkëpunimi midis Bankës Qendrore dhe Ministrisë Financave metet një instrument i rëndësishëm për të zbutur efektet e krizës. Së dyti do doja të thosha 2 fjalë për korrupsionin. Kam patur fatin shumë vite më parë, ndoshta një dekadë si sot, që të kryej një studim lidhur me korrupsionin dhe të pasur sukses në luftën kundër korrupsionit, ndërkohë që konflikti i interesave është bërë më evident dhe në forma më të sofistikuara. Kështu që duke qenë se ju një pjesë e elitës politike të një organizate të madhe që përmendën në fillim përmbledh 1 miliard banor të rruzullit, natyrisht detyra juaj primare është të ngjallni shpresë dhe atje ku nuk ekziston. Uroj dhe shpresoj që vlerësimi për teknisienet, për ekonomistët, paktën në kohë krizit.
Für Ihre Beiträge und ich wünsche uns allen einen schönen,